Hello all, and welcome to another season of On the Road with Vincent. Today, we are sitting atop the Blue Ridge Mountains in Fancy Gap, Virginia. Right behind me is I-77, and just beyond that is US-52. So on the channel, you know that we take many different highways, and I typically tend to stick to some of the more back roads, so to say, highways, the more scenic routes. And, to me, that's one of the things that makes the road trip worth it. As I've said many times ad nauseum on this channel, it's not about where you're going, but how you get there. I think the best part of a road trip is the sights you see along the way. So today, I'm actually going to show you the differences in taking the interstate system, or the U.S. highways, or even the U.S. highway business routes, or old highways, sometimes they're called. Because they all have their advantages and disadvantages. Now, for the most part, I tend to stick to the standard U.S. highway system. I think it's a good medium balance of getting there at a decent time and still being able to see a lot of sights along the way. But they all do have their advantages and disadvantages, and I hope to point them all out to you today. Now, this video might be filmed over a couple different days because gas is now over $4 a gallon in many places. So I'm going to try to space this out to save a little gas. So if my shirt all of a sudden changes, you'll know why. But first on our journey, we're going to get onto I-77 southbound. We're going to leave Fancy Gap, Virginia here, head south towards the North Carolina line, and just go right outside of Mount Airy, North Carolina. Now along the way, I'll show you the differences in time, miles, and of course all the sights that you'll see. So maybe by the end of this, you can decide what you like better. But we're going to get on the road here and start heading towards North Carolina. Hello all. Where would you like to ride today? The countryside? How about the city? Maybe a mountain forest? Or a sandy beach? No matter how far away, or in our own backyard, I hope you'll ride along. So as we now begin our journey down Fancy Gap Mountain, I'm going to show you as many sights along the way as I can, but I'll also show you the entire trip in hyperlapse form, so you'll get to see everything just sped up a good bit, but any of the really nice sights I'm going to try to film separately. So while most interstates I do find pretty boring for the most part, I-77, especially here in Virginia, is absolutely beautiful. You have the tunnels at the northern end close to West Virginia, and here as we're descending into the foothills in Piedmont, you have absolutely incredible sights. Now, something you may notice through here is the variable speed limits. They'll actually change the speed limit through here based on weather conditions. This is a really bad area for fog and high winds, and so, typically it's 65 miles an hour, but sometimes when the wind is really high, or there's a lot of fog, or just bad weather in general, they'll bump it down to 55 and even 45 sometimes. So naturally, one of the major benefits of the interstate is typically it is much faster driving. I mean, it's freeway all the way, constant passing lanes, and it really can speed up a road trip. But those are in the ideal conditions. Now, if you have any type of road work being done, if there's a wreck somewhere along the way, or any kind of traffic jam, it will slow you down for miles, sometimes even adding hours to your trip. So, that is one good thing that apps like Google Maps do offer. I'm kind of anti-GPS and stuff like that, but sometimes it is really good to check before you take a trip to see what traffic conditions are like. Another disadvantage to interstates is if you're needing to buy gas, while it's sometimes easier to come across gas stations along the way, the gas is usually significantly higher because they figure most people aren't going to drive all the way into town just to get gas, so they'll mark it up right along the interstate. Another pretty major advantage to interstates are the rest stops. And even better than that, if you're entering a new state on the interstate, you'll typically have a state welcome center. So we're now crossing the North Carolina line here at the NC State Welcome Center on I-77. Now, welcome centers are a great place to stretch your legs, use the bathroom if need be, and they're also the best place to get the official state highway map. And even better than that, it's free. So we actually went on inside the Welcome Center so I could get a new state map. The one I had was out of date, so picked up a new one for 2021, 2022. But you can also pick up state travel guides, and actually went ahead and grabbed a visitor's guide for Wilmington, trying to take a trip down there in the next month or two. But, like I said, it's all free. And you can get stuff for the entire state, travel guides, brochures, whatever, for the entire state, rather than, local stuff that you'd pick up in a town chamber of commerce. So I really do love welcome centers. I try to stop in every one I come across, even, if it's one as local as this. I only live about 20 minutes from here, but I still stop in here quite a bit, pick up a new map every year or so, and before I take any trip, I try to pick up some brochures to anywhere I'm heading to, if it's in the state. But we're going to get back on the interstate and finish out this portion of the trip. So we're back on I-77 now, and I'm not gonna lie, from this point on, I-77 is pretty boring until, you get a little closer to Charlotte, really around Mooresville, Lake Norman. That's when I-77 gets kind of interesting again. And then around Charlotte, you get to see the city skyline. But for the most part, between the Carolina state line and Mooresville, it is pretty boring, and it looks just like this. So this is where I really kind of draw the line for interstates. Sometimes when it's late at night, it's all right to take the interstate to cover a lot of ground, because you're really not going to see anything anyways. But it can also give you road hypnosis. And you just watch the cars and tail lights in front of you for miles and miles, hours upon hours, and it can put you to sleep pretty quick. I don't recommend taking interstates when you're tired, honestly. At least stop somewhere to rest for a little bit naturally, but if you can take the 2 lanes or just take the US highways, it can be a lot more interesting and keep you a lot more engaged in the trip. Now, one obvious disadvantage to taking the interstates is there is a lot more traffic. As I said earlier, if there's a traffic jam, it can back you up for miles and even add hours to your trip. But also, it's just a lot more stress-inducing. I much prefer having the road mostly to myself or just a few other cars. But, driving the interstates can be pretty nerve-wracking for some, especially around big cities. So we're actually going to branch off here onto I-74 towards Mount Airy. Now that's something that can be a little confusing to, more beginner travelers. Sometimes interstates will share the road with another interstate for a good number of miles, which US highways will do that as well. And sometimes, a US highway and interstate will share the same stretch of road. You just really need to pay attention, watch your road signs, look at the maps, and, just try not to rely on a GPS for everything. like I said, you'll be able to see this entire ride on the Hyperlapse, but honestly, there's really not much else to see for the rest of this route. You get a nice little view of Hanging Rock State Park out here in the distance, Sorrowtown Mountain, a little bit of Pilot Mountain over here as well. But honestly, this is one of the main reasons I hate interstates. It's just miles and miles of nothing. I really want to be able to enjoy the trip along the way, see some new things, and the majority of all interstates look the same. Now, of course it changes with the terrain. Once you get into the mountains, 77, even in the mountains, is actually really nice throughout Virginia and West Virginia. And, I've never been out to the desert or anything, but, I'm sure there's quite a few nice sights to see out there as well. But along here, yeah, it's all pretty much the same. Another actual advantage of interstates is that, when you need to exit the highway to somewhere, most of your exit signs and roads are very clearly marked. The exit number, what road you're turning off onto, what town you're heading towards, they're all very clearly marked. And sometimes on a US highway, it's really not. You just kind of have to know what roads are going to where, and maybe not necessarily know it in advance, but you should at least see it on your map. And that's why it's always good to have another person traveling with you to be your actual navigator. So we are now actually reaching the end of this segment of I-74. It picks up again just a little bit south of Winston, but this is as far as it comes here in this part of the state. I-74 is actually in a few different pieces throughout North Carolina, and it's one of the only interstates in the country that does that. But here we are, merging with US-52, just south of Mount Airy, North Carolina. So we'll pick up on US-52 northbound here in just a second. Alright, so we're now just south of Mount Airy, here at the foot of Pilot Mountain, and we're about to continue our journey back toward Fancy Gap, Virginia, heading north on US-52. Now we'll be sticking to the 52 bypass, which is kind of the mid-ground. You know, it doesn't quite bypass everything like the interstate does, but it doesn't go right into the middle of town like the business route will. So we'll still get to see a good little bit of the town, but this is, you know, like I said, kind of a mid-ground, not as fast as the interstate, but also not as slow as taking the business. But naturally, instead of heading south as we just did on the interstate, we're going to be heading north. So we'll actually get to see, you know, a little bit different of the journey. We will head south here in just a little bit on 52 from Fancy Gap. But this will offer a little different scenery. We'll actually get to see, you know, the approach of the mountains and going up the mountain rather than coming down. So sit back and enjoy this portion of the ride. Okay, so here's where we just split off a few minutes ago. And now solely on US-52, and here shortly it'll become the US-52 bypass as we get a little closer to Mount Airy. Okay, so the freeway portion of the highway actually ends right here as this becomes the 52 bypass. Now this is one disadvantage to taking US highways versus interstates. You have stoplights. Here you can see also another potential disadvantage of taking US highways versus interstates. You have railroad crossings. So if you really want to get somewhere by a certain time and you get stuck waiting for a train, then, you know, that could really put you behind, depending how long the train is, how much traffic there is waiting on it as well. So, you know, that's just another thing to keep in mind. Now, a definite advantage of taking US highways is it's actually typically much easier to access the town you're going through or nearby. See, right here is downtown Mount Airy, just right up the road here. And just one simple exit will take us there versus, you know, the interstate being a good few miles away from here and having to exit there and then find your way back to town. One thing that I honestly love, though, about taking the U.S. highways is the fact that they are typically much older than the interstates, and you get to see a lot of the older parts of the town and some of the relics, like these signs through here. You know, I've seen these things all my life, but, you know, it really just adds to the charm of some of these towns. You know, the towns that I've never been to before or don't frequent as much, when I get to see those little gems from the past. To me, that makes taking the highways far more worth it than the interstates, just because of all you get to see. So we've now just crossed back into Virginia, here in Cana, Virginia. And as you can see, US-52 has turned back into a 2-lane through here. It actually stays a 2-lane pretty much for the entirety of its run in Virginia. There's a couple places that it overlaps I-77, but really, for the most part, it's a 2-lane all through Virginia and through the better part of West Virginia. And that's something I didn't really mention is, you know, naturally interstates go a very long way. I-77 will take you from Cleveland, Ohio to somewhere, I believe, in South Carolina. I can't remember exactly where. But U.S. highways can go just as long, if not farther. 52, I can't even remember the southern and northern terminus of it. I can put it up on the screen here to look up later. So, you know, U.S. highways can go just as long, if not farther, than the interstates, and sometimes that kind of makes it even more worth it as well, just to be able to drive these older stretches of highways. Because most of them are far more scenic routes, and you really are missing a lot when it comes to choosing the interstate. I'm not really sure how well you can see this, but way off in the distance here, up on the mountain, you can actually see I-77 cutting across the side of the mountain where we just came down. So we're now beginning our ascent up Fancy Gap Mountain. This is the original pass to get up to the top of the mountain through here. Well over 100 years old. I don't remember when this road was carved. I remember seeing somewhat recently was the anniversary of it, like a significant year of the anniversary. And I mean, it's been here since the days of, you know, horse-drawn carriage going up the mountain. This was really one of the only passes in the area at that time. And along the way here, we'll actually see a few relics from another era. Now, I say that this was the original pass, and while that is true, there's also been quite a bit of work done to this stretch of highway over the last 100 years. There actually are a few old country songs that mention Fancy Gap Mountain. One of them actually refers to its old nickname of Killer Mountain. because a lot of tractor trailers years ago coming down the mountain would, lose their brakes and go off the side of the cliff over here. Now there's weight restrictions to coming down the mountain here, and it's a good bit wider, of course, now, and some of the curves have been straightened out a little bit. There actually used to be a runaway truck ramp along the way down here, but it's since been taken down since tractor trailers aren't allowed to come down the mountain anymore. Now, what we just passed there is actually one of those old relics from the early days of Fancy Gap. That used to be a hotel for people passing through the area. It's just about halfway up the mountain, maybe a little more. And, years ago, cars couldn't really make it that well up here, and horses could only go so long before they got tired out. So little inns like that were placed along the way for people to be able to stop and rest for the night. And the place also has a little bit darker history. It's not really well known now if these rumors are true or not, but most people do still tend to believe that at one time it was also a brothel in the area. A lot of people around here don't like to mention that part of the history, but it was a different time. I like to tell the full stories of places, and again, I don't know if the stories are true or not. That's just what I've always heard all my life, so they could be, they might not be. Either way, it's still pretty interesting. But as you can see, as we're topping out the mountain now, still far less traffic than taking the interstate. And that is another huge advantage to taking the US highways. There's typically less people, and I really love that. The less people and less traffic I have to deal with, the better. So we're now in Fancy Gap, Virginia, almost right back to where we started. So obviously some major differences in taking the US highways versus the interstates. But next, we'll show you what the US highway business routes have to offer. sitting right along the Virginia and North Carolina state line here in Cana, Virginia. We are still right along US-52. Now, I was going to start again at the top of the mountain and take you southbound on US-52, but it's actually kind of hazy out today, and gas is continuously getting higher right now, so and this video is long enough as is, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that part. You're not going to see anything different than you saw in the last part, so we're just going to go ahead and start right at the North Carolina line, where US-52 does break off here in just a couple miles to Business 52. But before we even get there, we're actually going to take some of the even older roads that was once US-52. It's now Fancy Gap Road and I believe Old Fancy Gap Road. So we'll get to see an even farther look back that most people just bypass today and forget about. But we're going to go ahead and get on the road here and start our descent on southbound US-52 Business. Okay, so immediately crossing into North Carolina here, we're going to take a left onto Fancy Gap Road. So many of these old highway whatevers, or some of the business routes, they can be a good bit curvier than the more modern US highway routes. This is because this is pretty much the old layout. They took whatever path was easier rather than just blasting out portions of mountains and hills and everything. They would try to follow the lay of the land and try to keep it around actual businesses, homes, whatever, and not just cut straight through into the middle of things as a lot of these highways do now. So not really a whole lot on this portion of the road, but it is still interesting to see exactly what you would have been seeing years ago crossing into North Carolina from Virginia on US-52. We're now going to cross directly over the highway, still onto Fancy Gap Road, and things do get a little bit more interesting on this road. As we get a little bit closer to town, you'll see some more relics from the past of what you would have been seeing upon entering Mount Airy, North Carolina. So this is one of my favorite little sights along the way on this portion of the road, that old gas station right there, which pretty much would have been the first thing you would have seen upon entering. This really wasn't considered Mount Airy at the time. I don't know if this was considered Franklin or really what this little area was called back then, but still something interesting to just think back on what you would have been greeted with upon entering town. As you can see right now, we're really just winding back and forth across US-52. But now we're actually crossing right over where the US-52 bypass begins onto US-52 Business. still ahead, you still see Pilot Mountain towering over everything below. So naturally, somewhat of a downside, if you want to consider it that, to taking the business routes is it's naturally a good bit slower. You'll have a lot more stoplights, stop signs, whatever the case may be, and a lot more traffic in town. But this is the best way to really get to see all these little towns that you're passing through on a road trip. Sometimes business routes will take you right through the heart of town. Now, Business 52 here actually bypasses Main Street, but you still get to see a good bit of the town, and of course you're just one road away if you would like to see the downtown district. So naturally, if you are in a hurry, then taking the business routes are typically not going to be your best option. But if you do want to take it slow, then I definitely suggest, take the old highways or the business routes, especially if you want to stop to see what the town has to offer, if you want to get something to eat, because along the interstates, really all you're going to find is fast food and your big chain restaurants. But when you go down the old highways and old roads, you can find a lot of the little small town restaurants, little local businesses. And in all honesty, in some of these smaller towns, it's really not that much longer to take the business highway routes rather than the bypasses, because they're kind of small. You might bypass about 5 miles worth of town, and really it's not going to be that much different. Granted, it depends on what time of day it is, the level of traffic and all that, but if you've got the time to spare, like I said, I definitely suggest branching off on at least a couple of business routes or old highways along your road trip. just like that, we're right back on US-52 South here at the end of the bypass and business sections. Within just a couple minutes, we'll be right back to the I-74 interchange. So that is where I'll end this portion of the video for US-52 business. So here we are once again at the foot of Pilot Mountain, just south of Mount Airy, North Carolina, along US-52. So with this video, I'm not trying to tell you to take one way over another of what road to take, because I use all three types of roads. I use interstates, I use the US highway system, I use the business routes, I even use state highways in many cases. All have their advantages and disadvantages. Now, for the most part, I will usually stick to US highways. They're just a little less crowded, but they'll get you there just about as fast as the interstate will. But there are trips that I'll take the interstate for most of the entire way, and some others that I'll even just stick with the back roads for a good majority of the way. What's important is I always try to at least take a different way back than the way I went. That way it keeps things fresh, and it makes the entire trip seem as interesting, whether I'm going or coming back. Now, as for the time differences and mileage, I'll put that up on the screen now, because I'll be honest, I forgot to keep up with it while I was filming, but also the fact that I didn't take some of these routes on the same day, and all times can vary, so I'll just put up the averages on the screen now, at least according to Google. But what was the point of any of this, you might wonder? Well, last year on the show, we focused on a theme of, looking back, retracing our steps, going back to where we come from, how we got where we're at now. That was a overarching theme last year, pretty much on the entire channel. But this year, we're going to be focusing on the present, but what are we missing? As you just take interstates that blow right past a town, we're always in such a hurry nowadays. We don't take the time to slow down, which is something I really am trying to do. Just try to slow down and enjoy where I'm at and when I'm at. And that's going to be the theme this year. What are you missing when you're just flying by, just rushing through everything and not taking the time to slow down and enjoy your surroundings? So, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of On the Road with Vincent, and I hope that you'll join me all the rest of this season in all my travels to come. Have a couple decent-sized trips planned this year, but probably keep a lot of these on a smaller scale, especially, if gas prices don't get any better. But again, I thank you all for joining me, and I will see you all next time.